I don't want to be the kind of cop who just goes along with things because it's easier. The chief nodded. Then prove it. The officer frowned. How? The chief tapped the file on his desk. Hendricks isn't the only one. There are more. Officers who've been operating under the radar for years, bending the rules, deciding who gets protection and who doesn't. His voice lowered. I need people I can trust. People who want to do this job right. The officer swallowed. You want me to help? I want you to decide who you are, the chief corrected. A bystander? Or someone who makes a difference? Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the officer straightened his shoulders. What do you need me to do? The chief leaned back. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Good, he said. Let's get to work. The next morning, the chief stood at the front of the briefing room. Every officer in the department had been called in. Some were nervous. Others defiant. The chief let the silence settle before speaking. I know some of you don't like what happened yesterday. His voice was calm, steady. I know some of you think it wasn't my place to take down a man like Hendricks. A few officers exchanged glances. I know some of you think I should have let it go, the chief continued. That I should have moved on. That I should have just accepted that this is how things are. He exhaled, then looked around the room. But that's not the kind of leader I am. Silence. The chief stepped forward. This department has a choice to make. We can keep doing things the old way, pretending corruption doesn't exist, ignoring the fact that good officers are afraid to speak up. His gaze sharpened. Or we can be better. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I didn't take this job to play politics, the chief said firmly. I took it because I believe in what we do. I believe in this city. And I believe in the officers who actually want to serve and protect. Not just when it's easy, but when it's right. His eyes scanned the room. So ask yourselves, which side are you on? The weight of his words hung in the air. The chief took a step back. That's all. Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving the officers to absorb what had just happened. Later that night, the chief sat in his office, rubbing his temples. He knew today had made an impact, but it wasn't enough. Change wouldn't happen overnight. Another knock at the door. He looked up to see the young officer again, but this time, he wasn't alone. 3 more officers stood behind him. The chief raised an eyebrow. What's this? The young officer swallowed. We've been talking. One of the others, a woman with a serious expression, stepped forward. We want to help. The chief studied them carefully. You sure? The young officer nodded. We're sure. A slow, knowing smile spread across the chief's face. Then let's get to work. The chief studied the group in front of him. 4 officers. Young, ambitious, and, most importantly, willing to change things. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't the entire department standing with him. But it was a start. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. If you're serious about this, then you need to understand something. The young officer, the one who had hesitated during the raid, nodded. We do. No, the chief corrected. I don't think you do. He exhaled. This isn't going to be easy. The people who were loyal to Hendricks? They're still here. They're still watching. Some of them might even be in this building right now, looking for ways to make sure nothing changes. The female officer, the one who had spoken up first, straightened her shoulders. We're not afraid. The chief gave her a sharp look. Then you don't understand the stakes. The room went quiet. After a long pause, the chief stood and walked to the window, looking out at the station. The officers moving back and forth, the quiet conversations, the lingering tension from everything that had happened. "They're going to test you," he said finally. "They're going to push back. They'll try to make you feel like an outsider. Like you're turning against your own." He turned to face them. "Are you ready for that?" The young officer swallowed. "What's the alternative? We just keep our heads down." The chief tilted his head slightly. "That's what most do." "But that's not why we became cops," the young officer said, more confident this time. "At least, not me." He looked at the others. "Not us." The chief studied them again. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right." The air in the room shifted. This was it. The real work was beginning. The pushback over the next few days, the precinct felt different. There were still officers who resented what had happened to Hendricks. Some avoided the chief entirely. Others made their opinions clear with sideways glances and half-muttered comments. The young officer felt it immediately. The cold shoulders. The way conversations stopped when he walked into a room. The way a few of the older officers looked at him like he had betrayed them. He hadn't even done anything yet, but he had chosen a side. And that was enough. One afternoon, as he was grabbing a coffee, a senior officer, one who had been close to Hendricks, approached him. "You really think this is gonna change anything?" the man asked, his voice low. The young officer glanced up. "What?" The senior officer smirked. "All this nonsense about fixing the system. You're wasting your time." The young officer squared his shoulders. "Maybe." He took a sip of his coffee. "Or maybe we're just getting started." The senior officer's smirk faded slightly. He stared at him for a long moment, then muttered, "Watch your back." And just like that, he walked away. The young officer stood there, gripping his coffee cup a little tighter. The commissioner nodded slowly. "Then let's find out who." Downstairs, the atmosphere in the precinct was different. Officers spoke in hushed tones, sneaking glances toward the chief's office. Some were angry at themselves, angry at how things had unfolded, angry at how much attention the situation had drawn. Others were uneasy, wondering what it meant for the department now that a man they had misjudged was in charge. The younger officer from the raid, the one who had recognized the family photo, sat at his desk, flipping through his report. He had rewritten it 3 times before finally turning it in, but he still wasn't satisfied. Why didn't I speak up? The question had haunted him all night. He had known something felt off from the moment they entered the house. The way the chief, though he hadn't known he was the chief then, hadn't panicked, hadn't reacted like a guilty man. But he had let the others lead. He had ignored his instincts. And now? Now, he wasn't sure what that said about him. The station door swung open, breaking his thoughts. 2 men in suits entered, moving with quiet authority. They weren't cops. They were internal affairs. A murmur spread through the precinct. The officers exchanged glances. They all knew what this meant. Something big was about to be uncovered. And for the first time since the raid, some of them felt the stirrings of something they hadn't felt in years. Accountability. Meanwhile, in his office, the chief sat in silence as the commissioner placed a thin file in front of him. "This," the commissioner said, "is where it started." The chief opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Then, his expression darkened. "Of course," he muttered. He should have known. The tip had come from inside the department. The chief stared at the file in front of him, his jaw tightening. The anonymous tip that led to the raid on his home hadn't come from a random citizen. It hadn't come from a neighbor suspicious of activity at his address. It had come from inside the department. The commissioner watched him closely. "I take it that name isn't a surprise?" The chief exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No. If anything, I should have expected it. The name on the report belonged to Deputy Chief Hendricks. A veteran officer, respected by some, feared by others. He had been in the running for the chief position before being passed over in favor of a younger, more progressive candidate, the man now sitting behind the desk. And it looked like he wasn't happy about it. The chief flipped through the file, his face unreadable. The commissioner let him process it for a moment before speaking again. IA has been quietly looking into Hendricks for months, he said. Nothing concrete yet, but whispers of, let's call it, selective policing. The chief's brow arched. Selective? The commissioner nodded. Certain cases get more attention, certain people get more protection. His instructions clear. The raid had been a mistake. A serious mistake. And he wanted every single report on who authorized it on his desk by morning. When he hung up, the commissioner exhaled. This won't go unnoticed. It's already spreading through the ranks. Good, the chief said flatly. It should. Outside, the officers shifted uncomfortably as the door finally reopened. The chief stepped out, his gaze sweeping over them. The commissioner followed, standing just behind him. The porch light cast long shadows over the group. Some of the officers couldn't meet his eyes. Others did, but not with an apology. More like defiance. The chief took a deep breath before speaking. I want to ask you all something, he said, his voice calm but firm. At any point tonight, did anyone question whether this raid was justified? Silence. The lead officer, the one who had commanded the raid, finally spoke. Sir, we received an anonymous tip. We were following protocol. The chief's expression remained neutral. Were you? The officer hesitated. The chief took a step forward. Did you verify the source? Did you run a background check on me before breaking down my door? Did you even hesitate before assuming I didn't belong here? More silence. The younger officer, the one who had recognized the family photo, shifted on his feet. His face was tense, conflicted. The chief turned to him. You figured it out before the radio call came through, didn't you? The younger officer swallowed. He nodded. And? His throat bobbed. I should have said something sooner. The chief's eyes remained on him. Why didn't you? The officer hesitated, but there was no excuse that didn't sound hollow. I don't know. The chief nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of them. That, he said, his voice cutting through the night, is the problem. His words hung heavy in the air. I wasn't wearing a badge. I wasn't in uniform. And because of that, none of you recognized me. But the truth is, you didn't even try. The moment you saw me, you had already decided who I was. A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably. The chief inhaled deeply. I have spent my entire career working twice as hard to prove I deserve the same respect as everyone else in this department. He let the word settle. And tonight? You just proved why I still have to. The commissioner watched, letting the chief take full control. This was his moment. One of the officers, an older man who had stayed silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was gruff, edged with frustration. With all due respect, sir, he squared his shoulders. This is a dangerous job. We can't afford to hesitate. The chief met his gaze evenly. Hesitation and assumption are two different things, officer. And you all made an assumption tonight that could have cost this department everything. The lead officer's face tightened. Sir, if we had known. The young officer stepped inside, tension on his face. Sir, I just heard, I saw it, the chief interrupted. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The young officer hesitated, then spoke softly. They want you to quit. The chief didn't respond. They want you out, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. The chief looked up. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then, the young officer swallowed. Are you going to resign? The chief let the question hang in the air. He had fought his entire life to get here. He had spent years proving he deserved to wear the badge, to lead, to change things for the better. And now? Now they wanted him to walk away. He glanced at the headlines again, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he stayed, the fight would get uglier. If he left, they won. Then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders. No, the young officer blinked. No? The chief's gaze was steady. I'm not leaving. The fight back that night, the chief went public. Not with a press conference. Not with a speech. With proof. Leaked documents. Financial records. Emails exposing the people behind the corruption. He handed it all over to internal affairs and let them do their job. And once the truth was out, the real scandal wasn't about him. It was about the people who had tried to frame him. The news flipped. Evidence of corruption exposed, city officials under investigation. Police chief cleared, who tried to take him down. One by one, the names behind the conspiracy fell. The officers who had been part of the raid? Some were fired. Others faced disciplinary action. The city officials who had protected Hendricks? Exposed. The media figures who had pushed false stories? Forced to retract. And the chief? He was still standing. A new chapter weeks later, the dust had settled. The city had changed. Not completely. Not overnight. But the message had been sent loud and clear. Corruption wouldn't be protected anymore. The chief sat in his office, watching the precinct move with a different energy. Some officers still didn't trust him. Others had started seeing him differently. But the most important thing? They knew he wasn't going anywhere. A knock on the door. The young officer stepped inside. Sir? The chief looked up. The officer smiled. I just wanted to say. I'm glad you stayed. The chief nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. Me too. He leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city. The battle wasn't over. It never would be. But today? Today, justice had won. And that was enough. For now. The lesson standing up for what's right is never easy. It comes with enemies, setbacks, and moments when quitting seems like the only option. But real change? Real justice? It only happens when people refuse to back down. The chief didn't fight for himself. He fought for something bigger. And in the end, that's why he won. The lead officer's stomach sank. The man on the floor slowly lowered his hands, locking eyes with him. One last time, the younger officer asked, almost in a whisper. Sir, who are you? The man exhaled, then spoke two words that sent a cold wave through the room. The new chief. A stunned silence fell over the officers. The weight of their mistake settled in instantly. The man, no, their superior, was watching them, waiting to see what they would do next. And none of them had an answer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The officers had stormed into this house expecting to take down a criminal, but now they stood frozen, their weapons still drawn, facing the very man who was about to lead them. The new chief of police. The lead officer, still gripping his firearm, swallowed hard. His mind raced, replaying every step of the raid. The forced entry. The barking commands. The assumption that the man before them couldn't possibly be anything other than a suspect. Sir, the younger officer stammered, still holding the family photograph. His fingers trembled slightly as realization set in. The man, no, the chief, slowly stood. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait. He simply rose, dusting off his slacks as if this entire situation were an inconvenience rather than an insult. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, scanned each officer, taking stock of who hesitated and who still hadn't lowered their weapon. The lead officer finally spoke, his voice uncertain. There must have been a mix-up. The chief's brow arched. A mix-up? The lead officer cleared his throat. We received an anonymous tip about this address. We were just following protocol. The chief inhaled deeply, then exhaled. Protocol. The word hung in the air. The weight of it made the officers shift uncomfortably. Tell me something, the chief continued, stepping forward. The officers instinctively stepped back. If this house belonged to someone else, someone who looked a little different, would you have stormed in like this? Would you have taken an anonymous tip as absolute truth? The lead officer's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The younger officer, however, had already realized the truth. He had felt it in his gut from the moment they stepped inside. The way they had assumed. The way they had judged. The chief studied their faces, waiting for someone to say it out loud. No one did. He sighed, shaking his head. Right. Just then, the front door swung open again, and in walked a man in a crisp suit, his badge flashing under the living room light. The commissioner. His face was tight with controlled fury as he strode inside, his eyes sweeping the scene. He took in the overturned furniture, the stunned officers, and finally, the man standing in the center of it all, his newly appointed chief of police. The article spread like wildfire. New chief under investigation, misconduct claims emerge. It was everywhere, news stations, social media, even whispered in the halls of his own department. The chief read the accusations, his jaw clenched. Fabricated. Twisted. A desperate smear campaign. The people who wanted him gone weren't just playing dirty. They were trying to destroy him. And the worst part? It was working. City officials hesitated to back him. Some officers, already uneasy about his leadership, saw the headlines and believed them. Doubt was spreading. And in the middle of it all, the chief sat at his desk, staring at the chaos unfolding around him. A choice to make a knock at the door. The young officer stepped inside, tension on his face. Sir, I just heard, I saw it, the chief interrupted. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The young officer hesitated, then spoke softly. They want you to quit. The chief didn't respond. They want you out, and they're willing to do whatever it takes. The chief looked up. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then, the young officer swallowed. Are you going to resign? The chief let the question hang in the air. He had fought his entire life to get here. He had spent years proving he deserved to wear the badge, to lead, to change things for the better. And now? Now they wanted him to walk away. He glanced at the headlines again, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he stayed, the fight would get uglier. If he left, they won. Then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders. No, the young officer blinked. No? The chief's gaze was steady. I'm not leaving. The fight back that night, the chief went public. Not with a press conference. Not with a speech. With proof. Leaked documents. Financial records. Emails exposing the people behind the corruption. He handed it all over to internal affairs and let them do their job. And once the truth was out, the real scandal wasn't about him. It was about the people who had tried to frame him. The news flipped. Evidence of corruption exposed, city officials under investigation. Police chief cleared, who tried to take him down. One by one, the names behind the conspiracy fell. The officers who had been part of the raid? Some were fired. Others faced disciplinary action. The city officials who had protected Hendricks? Exposed. The media figures who had pushed false stories? Forced to retract. And the chief? He was still standing. A new chapter. Weeks later, the dust had settled. The city had changed. Not completely. Not overnight. But the message had been sent loud and clear: corruption wouldn't be protected anymore. The chief sat in his office, watching the precinct move with a different energy. Some officers still didn't trust him. Others had started seeing him differently. But the most important thing? They knew he wasn't going anywhere. A knock on the door. And others? Well, they get doors kicked in. The chief closed the file. So what you're saying is, this isn't just about me. No, the commissioner leaned forward. But you're a threat to him. A new chief. Someone he can't control. Someone who sees the game he's playing. The chief considered that. Then, without a word, he stood, grabbing his jacket. The commissioner frowned. Where are you going? The chief's voice was calm but firm. To have a conversation. Downstairs, the station was buzzing. The arrival of Internal Affairs had thrown everyone off balance. Officers whispered, glancing at the two IA agents now seated at a desk, speaking in hushed tones. The younger officer from the raid, the one who had hesitated, who had known something was wrong, watched it all unfold. His gut told him this wasn't just about last night. This was bigger. Then the room fell silent. The chief walked in, his presence commanding attention. But he wasn't looking at the gathered officers. His gaze was locked on Deputy Chief Hendricks, standing near the coffee machine, pretending he wasn't concerned. The room felt colder. The chief walked up to him, standing just inches away. Walk with me. Hendricks smirked. Something wrong, chief? The chief didn't blink. That depends. He turned slightly. On whether you're going to answer my questions here in front of everyone, or somewhere more private. A few officers exchanged nervous glances. Hendricks rolled his eyes and followed the chief toward an empty office. As the door shut behind them, the station erupted into low murmurs. Inside, the two men stood across from each other, the tension thick. The chief crossed his arms. You put in the tip. Hendricks smirked. That's a strong accusation. The chief tossed the file onto the desk. Your name's all over it. Hendricks glanced down at the paperwork and shrugged. Anonymous tips happen all the time. You're telling me you're above suspicion? The chief didn't flinch. You didn't do this because of suspicion. You did this because you wanted me out before I even got started. Hendricks chuckled, shaking his head. Paranoia doesn't look good on a leader. The chief took a slow step forward. You sent a heavily armed team into my house on a fabricated tip. You put your own officers in a situation that could have ended badly. Why? Hendricks's smirk faded slightly, but he still held his ground. You think you're gonna come in here and change things? He scoffed. You think you're gonna rewrite the way this department works? He leaned forward. You don't belong here, and you know it. Silence. Then the chief let out a quiet chuckle. That's what this is about? He shook his head. You didn't think I earned this job, so you tried to humiliate me? Make me look incompetent? Hendricks didn't answer. The chief exhaled. You made a mistake, Hendricks. Oh yeah? Hendricks crossed his arms. And what's that? What? The commissioner said, his voice dangerously low. In the hell is going on here? The lead officer opened his mouth, But no words came out. What was he supposed to say? That they had raided their new boss's home based on an anonymous tip? That they had ignored every protocol for confirming their target? The commissioner didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the chief, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right?" The chief gave a small nod. "I'm fine." The commissioner exhaled, then turned back to the officers. His gaze was sharp and cutting. "Every single one of you. Outside. Now." The officers obeyed immediately, stepping out onto the porch. Only the chief and the commissioner remained. For the first time, the chief allowed a flicker of emotion to show. His shoulders, held so rigidly until now, lowered just a fraction. The commissioner ran a hand down his face. "I am so sorry this happened." The chief shook his head, but there was a heaviness in his eyes. "Not your fault." The commissioner studied him carefully. "You do know what this means, don't you?" The chief didn't answer right away. He walked toward the large front window, looking out at the officers standing in tense silence on his porch. Some looked ashamed. Others looked angry. But not one of them looked surprised. That was the problem. He turned back to the commissioner, his voice steady. "Yes," he said. "I know exactly what this means." The front door shut behind the commissioner with a heavy finality, leaving the officers outside under the dim glow of the porch lights. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their mistake pressing down on them. No one spoke. No one dared. Inside, the chief remained still, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the silhouettes of the men who had just stormed his home, treating him like a criminal. The commissioner exhaled, crossing his arms. "You sure you're all right?" The chief turned to him, his face unreadable. "Do you want the professional answer, or the real one?" The commissioner didn't flinch. "The real one." The chief's jaw tightened. "I should be furious. I should be filing a complaint. I should be demanding suspensions. But instead," he exhaled sharply. "I'm just tired." The commissioner nodded slowly. He understood. "I worked my whole life to get here," the chief continued, pacing slightly. "And within my first week, I have my own officers kicking in my door like I'm some street thug." He shook his head, his frustration barely contained. The commissioner studied him. "You want me to handle this?" The chief's expression darkened. "No. I need to." The commissioner wasn't surprised by the answer. The chief grabbed his phone from the coffee table, his hand steady as he dialed a number. The line clicked. "Put me through to dispatch," he said, his voice calm, authoritative. The commissioner remained silent as the chief spoke to the department, his words measured. It wasn't a threat. Not really. But it was a warning. And he knew what it meant, the resistance was beginning. The chief's next move meanwhile, the chief was making his own moves. Hendricks had been removed. But he wasn't the only problem. Corruption wasn't about one man, it was about a culture that had been allowed to fester. A system that protected itself. So the chief started digging. He met with internal affairs. Pulled records. Looked at who had been promoted under Hendricks, who had received questionable transfers, who had complaints mysteriously disappear. And what he found? It was worse than he thought. The web of corruption ran deep, deeper than just the officers who had followed Hendricks. There were connections to city officials, business interests, people who had benefited from keeping certain officers in power. This wasn't just about the department. This was about the city. And now? Now, the chief wasn't just fighting a few bad cops. He was going up against something much bigger. A city-divided word started spreading beyond the department. News outlets caught wind of Hendricks's removal. Whispers about corruption in the force started circulating. Some members of the community applauded the chief, calling him a necessary change. Others, particularly those with connections to the old system, pushed back. A city council member even went on television, calling the chief's leadership divisive and warning against shaking up a department that has protected this city for years. The chief watched the interview in silence. Shaking things up? That was exactly what he was doing. He turned off the TV and leaned back in his chair. The fight had just begun. And now? Now, the whole city was watching. The pressure was mounting. What had started as an internal shakeup was now spilling into the public. News stations debated whether the new chief was a hero cleaning up the force or a dangerous disruptor dismantling tradition. Inside the precinct, the tension was palpable. Officers whispered in corners, some keeping their distance from the chief, others watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up. And outside? The city was choosing sides. A public battle. The chief sat at his desk, scrolling through headlines. New police chief divides department, is this reform or retaliation? Longtime officers speak out, this isn't how things are done, can the chief be trusted to lead? He exhaled sharply. He had expected pushback, but the speed at which the city was turning this into a political war was staggering. A knock at his office door. He looked up to see the young officer, the one who had hesitated during the raid, who had since stood by him, stepping inside. "Sir," he said, closing the door behind him. "You need to see this." He placed a file on the chief's desk. The chief arched an eyebrow, flipping it open. Inside were leaked emails. The chief's gaze was steady. "You underestimated me." A knock on the door interrupted them. The commissioner stepped in, holding another folder. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it to the chief. The chief flipped it open. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He glanced up at Hendricks. "It's over." Hendricks frowned. "What?" The chief turned the folder toward him. Inside were bank statements. Wire transfers. Evidence of payoffs linked to officers under Hendricks's command. And now? Now those same officers were talking. Hendricks's face darkened. "You've got nothing." The chief smirked. "We'll see." He gestured to the commissioner. "Escort him to IA. They have some questions." Hendricks stiffened. "You can't do this." The chief tilted his head. "Actually, I can." The door opened, and two internal affairs agents stepped inside. Hendricks's face turned red, but he had no choice. As he was led away, the chief watched him go. He wasn't naive. He knew that removing one bad officer didn't mean the fight was over. But it was a start. And that? That was enough for now. News of Deputy Chief Hendricks's removal spread like wildfire. Officers whispered in the hallways, some stunned, others wary. Hendricks had been in the department for years, untouchable, or so they thought. Now? He had been escorted out by internal affairs. The chief watched from his office window as officers exchanged uncertain glances. He wasn't blind, some of them were angry. Not because they thought Hendricks was innocent, but because change was uncomfortable. And change had come fast. A knock at his door. The chief turned. The younger officer from the raid, the one who had hesitated that night, stood at the threshold. "Sir," he said cautiously, stepping inside. "I need to talk to you." The chief gestured for him to sit. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night." He exhaled. "I should have spoken up. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't say anything." The chief studied him for a long moment. "Why didn't you?" The officer swallowed hard. "Because," he hesitated. "Because I was scared." Not of the raid, but of going against my team. The chief nodded slowly. He had expected that answer. This department operates on trust, the officer continued. And I guess I always thought that meant trusting your team, even if, he trailed off. Even if they're wrong, the chief finished. The officer nodded, shame flickering across his face. The chief leaned forward. Let me ask you something. Do you think you're a good cop? The officer blinked, caught off guard. I try to be. Trying isn't enough, the chief said, his tone firm but not unkind. This job isn't about following orders blindly. It's about knowing when to question them. When to speak up. The officer shifted in his seat. Communications between high-ranking officers, a few city officials, and even certain media outlets. The chief's stomach tightened as he read them. The messages weren't just about resisting his reforms. They were about getting rid of him. Discredit him. Undermine his authority. Leak false reports. Make him the villain. If that doesn't work, force him out. He closed the file, his jaw clenched. They're coming after you, sir, the young officer said, his voice quiet. Hard. The chief exhaled slowly. I know. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the young officer spoke again. What are we gonna do? The chief looked up at him. And for the first time since this all started, he smiled. We're going to fight back. A new strategy. The chief didn't waste time. He called a press conference. Not behind closed doors. Not through anonymous leaks. A direct, public statement. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium. The room was packed, reporters, community leaders, officers who came just to watch. He took a deep breath, then spoke. There has been a lot of talk about what's happening in this department, he said, his voice steady. Let me be clear, I didn't take this job to make friends. I didn't take it to maintain the status quo. I took it because this department, this city, deserves better. A murmur spread through the room. I have spent my career fighting for justice, for accountability, for a department that serves all people, not just the ones in the right zip codes. He let that settle before continuing. And now? Now, certain individuals, both inside and outside this department, are trying to silence that effort. They want you to believe that I am the problem. That standing up for what's right is divisive. That fighting corruption is dangerous. His gaze swept the crowd. I ask you, who is really afraid of change? The tension in the room shifted. Let me be clear, he continued, his voice firm. I will not be bullied. I will not be intimidated. And I will not stop. Reporters fired off questions, but the chief held up a hand. This isn't about politics. This is about truth. And the truth? It's coming. Then, without another word, he stepped away from the podium. The backlash. The press conference hit hard. Social media exploded. Community leaders spoke out, some in support, others calling him reckless. But the people who had plotted against him? They panicked. Because now the public was paying attention. The chief knew what was coming next. They wouldn't back down. They'd double down. And sure enough, within hours, another headline appeared. Exclusive, new chief under investigation, misconduct claims emerge. The chief sat in his office, reading the article. False claims. Twisted truths. A fabricated scandal designed to drag him down. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The fight wasn't over. But now? Now, it was personal.